I'm Tom James, the Provost of Teachers College, and I'd like to welcome you to this event. Today's discussion affirms our commitment not only to the field of psychology itself, but also to bringing great minds together across disciplines. This event today underscores our broad vision of education writ large, the notion that learning occurs not only in classrooms, but also in homes, communities, churches, streets, and every other theater of daily life. People often ascribe that vision to John Dewey, and perhaps rightly so. But two other giants from TC's beginnings took an equally broad view of education. James Earl Russell was our first dean. He believed that TC should provide an orientation to what he called general culture, which he defined as training which would enable the student to see relationships existing anywhere in the various fields of knowledge, even the unity of all knowledge. It is thanks to Russell that Teachers College, its name notwithstanding, has, almost from the very first, offered classes not only in education and psychology, but also in nursing, nutrition, health education, and other fields not traditionally connected with schooling. It was also Russell who, in 1899, hired a young animal researcher named Edward Lee Thorndike and installed him as an instructor in genetic psychology. Thorndike had studied both with James McKean Cattell at Columbia and also with William James at Harvard. He had developed a new law of learning, the law of effect, as he called it, which held that the consequence of a particular behavioral response helped to determine whether that response would be likely to be repeated. As Thorndike began applying that idea to the validation of methods of teaching, he almost single-handedly launched the field of education psychology here at Teachers College. Thanks to Thorndike, TC became home over the years to a succession of brilliant psychologists. Among the faculty, the list includes Lita Hollingworth, an expert on gifted children and gender differences in education; Goodwin Watson, founder of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues; Edmund Gordon, champion of the concept of supplementary education, among others; Morton Deutsch, one of the fathers of the field of conflict resolution; and Leonard Blackman, leader in describing the learning processes of individuals in mental retardation. And the list goes on. TC can also claim among its graduates in psychology Carl Rogers, who forged a humanistic approach to psychology; Albert Ellis, the founder of rational emotive behavior therapy; and Rollo May, who outlined a series of overlapping stages that people pass through on the way toward shedding their egocentrism. Today, as our panel demonstrates, the legacy is alive and well. Psychology has emerged as one of our most compelling stories of interdisciplinary collaboration. TC faculty and TC alumni today are helping to describe learning as a dynamic interplay of motivation, cognition, intellectual and emotional development, identity, physiology, environmental influences, and many other factors. The college today includes more than 40 psychologists on our faculty, deployed across more than a half dozen programs. At any other institution, these scholars and researchers would mostly be housed in one department. But here, because their work takes them into so many aspects of learning, they collaborate with each other and with colleagues in nearly every program across this college. The issue of trauma offers a particularly powerful example of such work. Each of our panelists today is an expert on a topic that could not be more pressing in all of our lives. And while they bring to bear an extraordinarily rich and diverse range of perspectives, all have worked to distill the essence of a universal human experience and apply what they have learned for the human good. I can't think of a better description of what this school should be doing. Thank you, and I hope to see you at future roundtables in the psychology series. I'm going to turn it over to Marla Broussard, the moderator of the panel.
The way we've conceptualized traumatic events, defining it very generally as life-threatening events, or events that are life-threatening to us or those that we care about desperately, is part of life. And it's an experience that many of us are exposed to events like this. And so part of the conversation that we're going to be talking about is, are these normative events? Are these things that people just adapt to and to take in stride? And to what degree are some of these things so harmful to people in a very fundamental way that they have trouble moving on with their lives after these things happen? Even though traumatic experiences are a part of life and have always been a part of life, it's been recently late that we have started studying traumatic events scientifically. There's an enormously long history on war trauma, for example, and certainly studies were done early in this century with shell shock in World War I, picked up in World War II, but really got going after the Vietnam War and the Israeli wars with a very large sample, very sophisticated research studies on trauma. The other form of trauma that people frequently are exposed to, but there's been great resistance to studying, is child abuse. It wasn't until 1961 that parents battering children was kind of publicly acknowledged when Henry Kemp published his paper. It was the mid-'80s, really, where child sexual abuse began to be recognized. Domestic violence in the early 90s, and the area I study, psychological maltreatment, is still not illegal in New York State unless you hurt a child physically by causing colitis or driving a child to cut themselves. So these are the forms of abuse that are often most frequent. But as we learn more and more about human responses, and as we live longer, we're an opportunity to see how people are traumatized by horrific cancer treatments, where you're basically paying doctors to poison you within inches of your life in the hope of staying alive. People lose young children. Some people have great difficulty responding to the loss of children or spouses, etc. So our panel is going to be tackling these issues, and we're also going to be asking you to participate as well. 3 of the people here have active practices where they're treating people: Phil, Ghislaine, and Lisa. And Phil has developed a very well-regarded test to assess PTSD in children. So those are people's backgrounds. So I'll start with Ghislaine Boulanger. She is a TC alum, and she was looking for a dissertation topic in the mid-'70s in the TC clinical psych program. And she had the good fortune to be invited to join a group of social scientists who are undertaking what turned out to be the first congressional mandated epistemological study on Vietnam War veterans, focusing on the, quote, post-Vietnam syndrome, as it was then known. She investigated factors that made men vulnerable to breakdown in combat, and found that predisposing factors did play a role at lower levels of combat experience, but at high levels, at least a third of the former combatants showed significant symptoms without predisposing factors. So once her findings had been replicated, she participated as a member of the committee coming up, revising the original definition of PTSD for DSM-3R in 1985, and she was able to persuade colleagues not to have predisposing factors be a criterion for the diagnosis. Currently, she is working with psychotherapists in New Orleans, helping them both personally and in their work with clients deal with the psychological fallout from Hurricane Katrina. She's recently written a book in 2007 on Wounded by Reality, Understanding and Treating Adult Onset Trauma. So, thank you. Phil Tsai also was kind of captured by the field. He was a psychologist on the faculty at the American University of Beirut when the Troubles, I don't know what, that's what the Irish call thing. What do the Lebanese call the whole disaster?
They say the events.
The events? Okay, so Phil was there during the events. And because of the events, he ended up treating childhood trauma in children who'd been exposed to the events in Lebanon, and at some point had to flee the country himself. He has been working in trauma ever since, and he did the first imaginal exposure treatment for children that was published on treating PTSD in children. He has a test on diagnosing PTSD in children that, if you read the reviews, is a gold standard for diagnostic tests for children. He's had a number of really interesting findings from his studies, which youth who have PTSD he basically looks at kids that are carefully diagnosed as PTSD, those who've been exposed to generally equivalent traumas, and then comparison groups. And he finds remarkable differences between those who meet full criteria for PTSD and those who've been exposed and those who haven't been exposed. And so the controls look very much like those who've been exposed but don't develop the symptoms. So he was also involved in the DSM committee, DSM-4, and he's been very widely recognized for his work. He's currently doing research at Bellevue, and a number of his students are here in the audience, and we're very happy to have him here with us. George Bonanno is a faculty member in the clinical psychology program, and George has taken a very different tact. His life experience led him to the revelation at a young age that events that are sometimes supposed to be very disorienting and kind of shaking up of life don't always end up that way. He had a father who from a young age had very major health problems, and when he died when George was 23, George felt that this was a relief because he didn't have to. His father wasn't suffering, his family wasn't exposed to his father's suffering, and that created kind of an insight that maybe things that we think are kind of traumatic for people, at least very distressing, are things that maybe we're built to deal with, or some of these events are things that we are kind of built to deal with. And so he's kind of revolutionized the research on bereavement, because his research shows that so many people can grieve and move on in ways that suggest this is a normative event. However, his work and the work of others has also shown that there's a group of people that don't move on. And many people in this group have symptoms of trauma, of PTSD symptoms, major depressive disorder. And that's the group, the complicated bereavers that you're now focusing on. Okay. And Lisa Miller, who is also a faculty member in the clinical psych program, and I am not going to talk, believe me, after I'm done introducing everybody. She also, like everyone here, I think their life experience led them in a certain direction. And her life experience as a young clinical psychologist led her to work with two different groups. One was a group of clients in inner city Philadelphia who were coping with their first experience of major depressive disorder, which, if you have had this disorder, if you have worked with clients who have this disorder, or if you have a loved one who's had this disorder, many high rates of people would rather have bad cancer than to have this, because it makes people so intensely miserable, where the highlight of your day can just be fantasizing about killing yourself. So she was working with this group, and she was also at the same time, or a comparable period of time, working with teenagers in Washington Heights who had terrible life experiences, but they had very low rates of depression. So her insight was two things. One, demographics don't determine major life depression. People can look at your life and think it's hell, and you can be just fine in terms of your mental state. And people can look at your life and think, my God, he or she has everything, what could they possibly complain about? And yet they have major depressive disorder. So that was insight number one. Insight number two was working with these very depressed inner city clients. She found that those who were able to use this experience of pain and suffering to find a deeper meaning in life, often a spiritual meaning, broadly defined, which she'll speak more about, enabled them to, in many ways, transform their life. And if they were able to establish this deeper connection, then this proved in those clients to be protective, such that over a 10-year period, instead of having a high rate of relapse like you often have with people who have early onset major depressive disorder, 90% of them were protected by this spiritual experience. And so this totally transformed her work. And she has become very well known for really looking at spirituality, again, broadly defined, as an effective treatment for depression. So that's our panel. Okay, so we're going to start with the first question, which is, what defines a traumatic experience or exposure to trauma?
What defines a traumatic event? And my answer is going to be based on the DSM-4. And according to the DSM-4, which probably all of you know, there are two things. One person should have been exposed to a truly life-threatening event, something which presented or constituted a threat to their health, their physical integrity. And the second thing which we need to make a diagnosis is how people reacted at the time. And they should have really represented that at the time they felt helpless, horrified, or very, very scared. And that's the current definition which clinicians use to make a diagnosis. It used to be something else in the past. I think when the DSM-3 was published, we said, oh, it means exposure to a significant stressor well beyond the realm of normal human experience. But when the DSM-4 was being made, we had some discussions, and it became apparent that more than half the country has been exposed to a life-threatening event like that, so we tried to tighten up the definition. I guess that's what I have to say.
Okay. When Tom James was speaking, I just was suddenly flashed on the fact that my mother-in-law got her PhD studying with Thorndike in 1921. Wow. So she's not with us anymore, but it suddenly felt like a nice continuity. I'm very glad you have this question, because I do think the question of trauma is, the term trauma is far too loosely defined most of the time. I mean, when I started doing this work, things were called stressors, not traumas. And we had stressors from being in combat to getting ready for Christmas. And yeah, I mean, I find it a bit difficult to get ready for Christmas. But that these should be comparable events was really silly. And I think often we don't do well enough with trauma either. But I'm with Phil on this. I'm a psychoanalyst, and it's sort of unusual for psychoanalysts to look at the extremes of human experience, but that is indeed what I'm interested in, and how to bring psychoanalytic thinking into these extremes of human experience. So, like Phil, I'm talking about people who have survived sudden, untimely, often violent death. I mean, they thought they were about to die and they didn't. Or they've witnessed another person being brutally killed or maimed, or heard about such deaths in those close to them. And I'm just going to take a very quick example here. On 9/11, everybody was going around saying, oh, I was so traumatized. Well, of course, it was an absolutely awful event. We were all made terribly anxious. My office is on 101st Street, and I was in that office. I was not traumatized. However, I work with people who escaped from the burning towers or from buildings right close to there. That is what I considered trauma. And I want to say why I use the expression adult onset trauma rather than PTSD, because I think that the diagnosis, when I'm talking about adult onset trauma, I sometimes am not working with people who meet all the DSM-3R criteria, or the DSM-4 criteria. I know Phil and I have some disagreements about this, perhaps. What worries me about the diagnosis is that it's kind of been commodified. And I also feel that the goalposts get moved by the insurance companies, and often, as I well know, by the VA. So that sometimes it's too narrow for what I'm talking about, and sometimes it's too broad. So that's what I have to say about that.
This is always so interesting. This is probably one of the most interesting questions we could ask. And there's endless debate about this, and nobody can quite figure it out. The next incarnation of the DSM will have another answer. I think it already does have another answer. They're preparing it. They're leaving out the hopelessness and the helplessness stuff. But the research that I do looks at broad groups of people, and so we're interested in the kinds of people who go through what we would consider horrible things and they're okay. And that's never to dismiss traumatic reactions. But you take people who were in the World Trade Center and got out, for example. We did a number of studies with people in that situation. We just completed a very large study on an enormous population from the military, all who had been deployed. And only a relatively small percentage develops PTSD. They've been through what we would consider a traumatic stressor, but it's a tricky word, so I often use the word potentially traumatic event, the PTE, because the same event, even though we can agree they're all potentially traumatic, being in a life-threatening situation, turning on these very primitive systems that we have that just say, oh my God, I am just in such deep doo-doo right now, and I'm in trouble. And when those systems get turned on, everything just gets put secondary, right? But only a small percentage develop PTSD, so what goes on there? So we're that's the kind of thing that we're interested in my research. And so these reactions we have are these normative traumatic stress reactions, which is a kind of a funny phrase, a normative traumatic stress reaction, but they're very adaptive, these reactions that we have, and for most people, they do a very good job. And I think my own perspective has been, there's been far too little attention to why it is that we can go through these events and have these reactions and essentially be okay. And then what the difference is between the people that can happen and then the people who develop PTSD. And we don't know the answer to that. We really don't know what goes on in normal reactions to these potentially traumatic events. It's very hard to study. You can ask people afterwards what happened. And probably most of the time they say, I don't know. Because part of the reaction is the kind of a dissociative state, and there are all kinds of buffers, so we really can't report on it. But the facts are, the epidemiological facts are that many people go through those events and they are okay. And it's only when we can't turn that response off that we develop PTSD. So we know that, but we just don't know how it works. And it's interesting because that's what the National Institute of Health is now switching its focus to. It took a long time, but the NIH is switching its focus. I think it's called RDoC, this new perspective, which is to look at what are the things that lead up to psychopathology rather than looking at psychopathology. And we don't know the answer to most of those things. So that's really interesting to me.
A traumatic world in which hurricanes and floods, right, are of higher frequency than even 30 years ago. Right, merits our consideration to look at trauma in collective, right, in tandem with our sisters and brothers around the world. And whereas psychology has traditionally looked at the level of the individual or of a specific culture, we seem truly, as a world, to be engaged collectively in metabolizing global trauma. And so how to come to terms with that and share that coping is actually within our reach. And I had the opportunity to speak with some of our wonderful alumni before the start of our discussion about just this, that if the youth in North Africa and in this country and around the world can connect and in collective transform the complexion of our earth, that certainly we can work together in collective on global trauma.
Marla introduced me in terms of my personal experiences, I'm really into data. And I like data a lot, and I like big, huge amounts of data. And if you follow large groups of people over time, you do see, and there have been some really long studies now that have been done over 20, 30 years, you do see some people who develop very late onset delayed symptoms. And it's hard to know what's causing that. Is it other aspects of their life that are, causing those kind of problems? But I think for the most part, I would argue, based on these lots and lots of data, that most people, when they're okay, they actually are okay. And that, like I said, I don't expect it, people necessarily to like this and, this response, but I really do think it's true. And I think for my personal view, based on the research that my family tells me I do too much of, that I think that we have for too long assumed that when people are okay, that there's some hidden pathology, and I just don't think it's there. And I do think people have gone through really horrible things during World War II, and in many cases, World War II is a pivotal example of a kind of a mass event that just everybody had to deal with and just swallow it and move on. And there are some delayed reactions from that, definitely. But I think for the most part, I would argue that the earlier view that when people are okay, they're okay.
Let's move on to the next question. And I want to start with Lisa here. Do we learn or change from such experiences or merely endure?
We've met with children and adolescents over the past decade and a half to talk about what has in their life been transformative and ignited for them a deep, meaningful transition. And in almost every case, adolescents and young adults talk about deep personal suffering. They talk about watching a grandparent die, fearing a parent's death, a traumatic experience. Almost every young person has talked about an intimate relationship of loss. Through that very painful road of trials, nearly every adolescent with whom we've spoken has found a deeper understanding of life itself, of who they are on earth, of what purpose and meaning they hold. And they have started as young adults down a spiritual path. That transformative process of spiritual awakening through suffering in young adulthood very often becomes the lead foot on which they rely throughout life. If we step back and look at lots and lots of young adults simultaneously, using rather than a narrative approach, a quantitative bird's eye view over thousands of kids, we find that spiritual awakening through which is established an ongoing personal spirituality is more robustly protective against pathology than anything else known to social science. It is 90% protective against recurrence of major depression. It is 60% protective against lifetime course of substance use and abuse. There is nothing in the social sciences that protects against adult pathology like the setup in early adulthood of personal spirituality as a way of living to be carried forward. Recently, we've looked using MRI at the brain, and we've seen in adults who are roughly my age, no longer adolescents, I'm 45, we've seen in adults a different looking brain. We've seen a thickening of the cortex. The cortex has a lovely tree-like structure, and it is thicker among those people for whom personal spirituality has been a lead foot over time. A thick cortex, we know from other people's work, is associated with high IQ. It's inversely associated with Alzheimer's and inversely associated with depression. So it is helpful, perhaps, to speak of personal spirituality not merely as a belief, but as a phenomenological reality, which can be shown physiologically, materially, to change our brain. And that, I think, is worthy of support in young people.
Yeah, I mean, I know that 20% between 20 and 30% of people who are in high combat actually develop PTSD. The reason that I say adult onset trauma is that I do believe that people who have the kind of experiences that I'm talking about have some kinds of symptoms. That as they may not come and see me or you, if you're clinicians, but people are changed by this brush with death, this intimate knowledge of mortality, which probably most of us in this room haven't had. I don't know. I mean, I'm afraid that some of you have had. But it is a life changer. That is the Rubicon that I look for when I'm talking about change. And then this takes us to the whole question of latency. I knew there was going to come a point when I would really disagree with George. And this is it. I do believe that as people age, their ability to keep those sort of dissociated reactions at bay changes. We are seeing now Vietnam veterans, as they are getting to be senior, isn't that ridiculous? Vietnam veterans, senior citizens, that doesn't work. But anyway, they are. And they are really, some of them turning up at the vet centers for the first time. When I went down to New Orleans for the first time, it was 3 years after Katrina, and people were terribly ashamed that they had suddenly started to feel not all right. They had what they called their pioneer spirit after the hurricane. They had to get the kids back in school, get food on the table, quite literally get the roof back over their heads. I'm seeing psychotherapists, so they had to get the patients back. And then suddenly they said, oh my God, why am I so depressed? What's wrong with me? I mean, other people had it worse than I did. And this is what they call their pioneer spirit. And I had to make it clear to them that, in fact, there is this latency period while you're getting your act together. Very much we saw this after the Holocaust, too. And, I mean, I could go on talking about examples of latency, but I certainly know when I've worked with people who've developed a case of, again, you call it PTSD or adult onset trauma, really probably meeting full criteria. In one case, a Vietnam veteran, 20 years after, he had a flashback because of an event, an external event, that matched stimulus by stimulus, an event that had happened to him in Vietnam, and he was gone. He couldn't go back to work. He was actually working very high up as a corrections officer. So now, of course, because I'm not an epidemiologist, I can only talk on the sort of individual level, and people present themselves to me. I see a skewed sample, but I really do feel that you are changed with this brush with mortality, and at some point, those symptoms will emerge. Do I have anything else to say? Yes, how very intolerant society is of knowing that this is the case. We don't want to know how frail we all are. We want to believe you can snap out of it.
Good point. Phil?
Thank you. Let me just restate the question so I'm on the same page with everyone. And I believe Marla represented, do we learn or change from such experiences or merely endure? I mean, at the most basic level, I think it depends on your definition of what learning is, and if you're talking about change in behavior, I'm going to address it or try to address it. And I like what my learned colleague, Professor Bonanno, said about data, and my comments are empirically based, okay, from studies, from lots of studies. We know that most people who've been exposed to a life-threatening event, a traumatic event, we know very well that children, adolescents, and adults, the overriding majority, do not develop long-term psychiatric morbidity. It's not one study. The studies are legend, going back to the Second World War. if one reads Jack Rackman's fantastic book, which I would like to recommend, Fear and Courage, he reviews the literature. And they, just like the people in New York, the British were expecting, knew the Blitz was coming, so they mobilized and they expected massive psychiatric casualties, which did not occur. They did not occur. And there were short-lived fear reactions, but again, the overriding majority of traumatized people did not evidence long-term psychopathology. And there have been, as Professor Broussard indicated, this has been extensively studied. It's one thing we do know. The majority of people do not develop psychopathology. Over the years, I've been interested in a question. What happens to those who've been exposed to traumatic events, truly traumatic events, but don't meet criteria for what I was trained to do, make diagnoses on disorders? So for 25, 30 years, I've been doing what's called a case control study, looking at children who really meet full criteria for PTSD, comparing them to children who've been exposed to very similar traumatic incidents and don't have PTSD in a control group who were never traumatized. And it's pretty consistent across all these measures. Youth with PTSD were always significantly more anxious, more depressed. They have very low self-concept relative to traumatized negatives and controls. I can go on. Their verbal IQ in the Wechsler, the entire Wechsler, was significantly lower. And we have teachers here. Their level of academic achievement was significantly lower. Lower than who? Lower than traumatized negatives without PTSD and controls, which I think we'd expect. Now, what about all those traumatized PTSD negatives? On every single assessment, and this has been published in peer referee, and traumatized PTSD negatives and controls did not significantly differ. So I think there's a message there. I think, yes, some people will be affected, and I think the majority are not. And it's important to make a good diagnosis.
I think that what Ghislaine said is real, that there are people who develop late onset trauma reactions and they don't get much respect, they don't get much sympathy. But I also definitely agree with Dr. Sai's comments. The epidemiological data are really sobering. Most of us are exposed to horrific things. We don't even remember. We did some studies with undergraduates at Columbia, and they were exposed to all kinds of stuff, and they didn't remember it at the end of the study 4 years later when we asked them about it. And I think that people do learn. I like to look at why is it that, as I've said before, why is it that we can be exposed to these things and come out okay? Because I think the reactions, the traumatic stress that we have is functional. That's why we have it. That's why we get so upset. That's why we have flashbacks and our arousal goes way up and we get discombobulated. It's actually doing something. And what it's doing is it's partially teaching us about what we went through. A couple of summers ago, my son ripped his leg open up in the mountains. And I was much worse off than he was, especially when he got the Novocaine. He thought, all right, I can handle this. But I was a mess for a few days, and I thought about it. You think to yourself, part of me is freaking out as his dad, and the other part of me is saying, this is really interesting that I'm having these reactions. But I learned a great deal. I replayed every single second of that event. And but after a few days, I knew exactly what happened. I knew exactly how long it took. I knew how much time I had. If anything like that happens again, I'm going to know what to do. And I think that's why we have those traumatic stress reactions. So there is learning in that regard. And it's learning that makes us better copers, I think.
And if I can just say, you see, and I agree with you entirely about that. I think that the symptoms of adult onset trauma, as they occur, actually protect us. So I'm agreeing with you and disagreeing with you. They protect us from absolute terror. but then they keep us kind of frozen there. And it's at that moment that we have to start the replaying. And sometimes we need to replay it with someone.
We have seen that it makes a difference at the time of the event to frame it or to bring their own gifts and resilience and resources, so that if they see it, the meaning making of it, oh, this is the end of my world, or this is a challenge, I never experienced it, but let me see what I can do one step at a time, as Martin Luther King says. So if somebody's there guiding that person not to globalize and make it the end of the world, but to make it, it's a challenge, it's something new, we have not experienced it, but we have the support for you, we're here with you, and we're going to make this, we're going to go through it together. And the level of PTSD then is much different than those who were left, child soldiers left in Sierra Leone mountains to fend for themselves.
Okay, so you're really talking about what helps people become more resilient. What can we collectively do to
Which
increase that?
really, differentiates from full-blown PTSD as opposed to, manageable levels of...
Levels of stress. Okay, very good comment.
Dr. Miller, I have a question about what you meant about spirituality. What is your definition of spirituality? Were you talking about actual belief in the supernatural or more introspective-looking spirituality? Please elaborate on that.
The findings I was sharing from the research on personal spirituality as protective against the most prevalent forms of pathology. Usually, the most robustly protective dimension of spirituality, the piece of spirituality which shows most protective qualities, is a direct personal relationship with your higher power, the Creator, God, whatever language the young person chooses to express their ultimate higher power. And for instance, children will say, I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. When I have a tough decision to make, I ask myself, what really would my higher power want me to do? So a sense of two-way living daily relationship, a very personal, intimate relationship. One young girl found herself very alone, very, very alone, in a large town, actually accepted. She was different. She was from a different world. And she was asked, when you're standing there at lunch all alone, how does it feel to be just totally all by yourself, alone? And she got a huge smile, and she said, oh, I'm not alone. I'm right there with God. So her sense of walking through school each day was in relationship. And that's a very different sense than being all alone.
When a person has been traumatized or they've experienced multiple traumas, it normally means that they let go and they just surrender their will to accept God's will. Have you encountered any cases where an individual had faith at one point and decided to also let that go because the traumas kept building? It wasn't just one, it was multiple, and it got to the point where the person just couldn't cope anymore. They didn't turn to suicide, but they may have taken another path, and it didn't include their faith in God. Have you come across any cases like that?
The young people with whom we've worked, some of them have experienced trauma and abuse, and we've found that through the experience of abuse, they form a different type of spirituality than had they not experienced the abuse. They tend to have less connection with any religious organization or denomination from their family of origin, because the messenger who brought that to them proved unworthy and hypocritical. So God, as it was spoken by their abuser, was the God who wasn't there when they were being harmed. Through deep spiritual work, that very same child can come to have a very personal, sacred relationship with God. It takes on a very different form than it might have had they been in a family where the messenger lived out, that of which they spoke. Yeah.
Specifically, what I'm thinking about is I work with torture survivors, doing evaluations when they're here seeking asylum. And I almost always ask, what helped you to get through it? and very often it is their Muslim or Christian faith. But sometimes it's also their political belief system. And that seems to be, for the people who that is a motivating factor, it's just as powerful as the spiritual. So I was wondering what you think about that.
That's very interesting. So to be part of something bigger than oneself is itself meaningful and full of purpose. In looking at young adults, we've looked at existential well-being and connection to a collective, and those are very meaningful forms of resilience. They're protective against depression. There is an added protective quality of a connection to God, of a transcendent relationship. So yes and yes, right? A connection to something more than oneself gives meaning, purpose, and guidance. A connection to something bigger than oneself that is sacred and transcendent has an added protective benefit against depression.
I think we're already moving into our next question, dealing with the whole issue of resilience. But George has a follow-up question for you.
Yeah, actually,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Fran. This is a kind of a personal interest. But do you think that torture is the worst thing that can happen to anyone? And my guess is it is. I wonder if you think that. It seems like the worst
On
possible.
some level, yes, but when I talk about torture survivors, I'm talking about various forms of torture. So it could be spousal abuse, it could be child abuse, it could be people being thrown in prison, and it could be the actual physical act of torture, the kinds of things we've heard of. But it also is something like solitary confinement over extended periods of time, which is so common in our country. All of these, the psychological effects, from what I know, are very often much more devastating than the physical effects.
Thank you.
If we are actually talking about physical torture and solitary confinement, which I've actually been writing about today, is something else again, but when you are being physically tortured by someone, they have probably had to erase you. I mean, they haven't probably had to. They have erased you in their minds. You are in the presence of someone for whom you do not exist. And that is a very, very powerfully negative experience, to have been already killed by someone in their minds. Even if, and when I say killed, I am here talking metaphorically, because in fact they aren't going to kill you. They'll take you to the point of death. They'll take you to the point of pain. But this erasure in the other's mind, when they're very close to you, is a devastating psychological experience. Yeah. So I would agree with you.
Our third question is, which we've already kind of moved into, is are there resilient and non-resilient types of people? What is known about the factors that predict or enhance resilience? How much depends on one's genetic makeup? How much on environmental factors? Phil, would you like to start?
Sure. Again, I think I'd like to start by saying that this has been studied for a long time, and that's a very good question you presented, Marla. For the majority of traumatic incidents are capable and have induced PTSD or psychopathology, if you will, among a subset of examinees. I'm talking pretty objectively. Among children, if you look at reported what's called prevalence, and you need to put on rubber gloves, but I studied maybe 50, 60 studies, and looked at what they called the prevalence, and they're using different tests at different points in time. But about 25% of the samples, approximately, that's the average, came up with a positive diagnosis. That means 75% didn't meet criteria now. If we look at what's called risk factors, or the flip side, protective factors, I think that's a really important question. What protects people or what puts people at risk? And I don't think there's any one answer, but there is evidence to say the following. We know of people like you just mentioned are intentionally harmed, traumatized by others. That typically leads to greater psychopathology relative to cases that were in motor vehicle accidents or fell off a ski lift somewhere in Vermont. This has been documented in large-scale epidemiological studies, case control studies. So intentionality has something to do with this. I think one of the really big things, if we're considering who develops PTSD and who doesn't, is when you test them. And time is a great healer. Typically, the greater the interval between trauma exposure and psychological evaluation, the better the outcome. And it makes sense if you stop and think about it. People getting upset, but if you talk to them 6 months later, a year later, the majority don't seem to be upset anymore. There are a lot of other risk factors. A history of family psychopathology is not a good thing. It's not only for PTSD, but for conduct disorder, for ADHD. The presence of family support, and that's something which I think is exceptionally important, is a major protective factor. And again, I always say it's the diagnosis. If a child has PTSD, they're at risk. If they're traumatized and they don't have PTSD, well, I'm not as worried. So the list we could talk all night, and it's not any one point. It's a variety of factors that could put people at risk or could serve to protect them. Having a high verbal IQ could be one of them.
Okay, thank you. Ghislaine?
I'm going to ask a rhetorical question and make it rhetorical only because I'll ask you to think about it later. I really want to know what resilience means. If it means that you don't develop PTSD, then as it is measured by DSM, then okay, that's fine. I mean, I've got it. But I think it's really important that I see such tautological definitions of PTSD that's why I raised the question. But to go on for a moment, my psychoanalytic intellectual hero is a man called Henry Crystal. I don't know if any of you are familiar with his work, but this was someone who survived Auschwitz as a teenager. And came to this country and became a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. And in the 60s started writing about the Holocaust survivors at a time when people were not doing that. I mean, at this point, people write about it a lot. But there was so much stigma to talking about the Holocaust through the 60s. And he wrote about it a lot, and he knows whereof he speaks, as you can imagine. He would probably look like one of the people who doesn't develop symptoms, but I think he does. But anyway, my private argument with George here. What Henry says, and I think it's so important, is that he says every survivor is resilient. And I think that's terrific. If that's what you mean by resilience, then I'm all for it. I get worried when you use the term resilience to privilege those people who don't appear to have symptoms and to denigrate those who do have symptoms. And I think this is a very, very dangerous trend that we are moving toward. So I leave the talk about epidemiology to the others who know more than I do.
George, we haven't heard any comments on the genetic realm, so I have a feeling looking at you and Lisa, you're the more likely to tackle that one. What do we know about, do we know anything about genetic makeup, specific genes?
I can tell you quickly just the paradigm to clarify after the question that Giselle raised. So in this kind of work, you define patterns of outcome over time, and there are definitely a group that typically overwhelmingly the majority who have almost no symptoms, and they have high functioning, and they do all those things that we normally consider health. And we can call them resilience, we can call them stable trajectories of healthy people, we can call them whatever we want to call them. And they're that group of people, they're typically the most common pattern we see across all the swatches of people who've been exposed to these fairly difficult events. Then there are some people who develop PTSD, there's some people who gradually recover, et cetera. So I've been focusing on those people who show just essentially a clean bill of health over a long period of time. And they're usually around 60, 70% of the samples, maybe around 60% to be on the safe side, depending on the event. Some events are much more caustic than others, but we see a lot of that. Those people do show, there are a whole cluster of factors, and I very much agree with Dr. Sai on this regard, that they're really essentially a whole bevy of risk and resilience factors. If you have more of the resilience factors, you're more likely to be in that really healthy group. One of them is genes. There are a couple of polymorphisms now that have been fairly clearly associated with that resilient pattern. There are some personality variables also suggesting a resilient type. The big caution with all of this stuff is that they're all small effects. So there is a genetic factor, but it explains a tiny portion of the pie. The New York Times, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, put it on the cover of the magazine. If you read that article, you wouldn't go away thinking, you'd go away thinking if you had the genes, you're golden. If you don't have the genes, you're in big trouble. But in fact, if you have those two polymorphisms, you've got a 5% better chance of being in that resilient group. If you're a resilient type, optimistic, hardy, that kind of person, you get another 5%. If you got a nice big social network around you, get another 5, maybe 10% for that. If you got a lot of resources, you throw in some more. And a lot of the things that make people resilient or stable trajectory of healthy functioning are not the kind of things we focus on. They're the kind of more mundane things, like not just having resources, but having resources you can rely on when the resources you have are gone, right, and those kind of things. So you can add up all these different things, your health, how much stress is in your life in an ongoing way, et cetera. All those things add up. And if you got a bunch of those things, the example you gave of some of the long, drawn-out Civil War context, in those contexts, those people have none of these things. They have poverty, they have, social fabric is destroyed, they have political turmoil. So those people are tremendously at risk, and you don't see as much of what this kind of pure resilience that I'm talking about in those countries, because they're just too much. So that's how we can think about these events, and that, at least that's the perspective that I've been taking. And it's not necessarily the epidemiological perspective, because that's a mouthful. So how about I don't know what else to call it, but it's something like that.
Thank you. Lisa?
To pick up on the discussion of genes, if you look at twin studies, twins raised together, twins raised apart, twins in the same home, twins in different homes, you can look at the relative contribution of heritability, shared environment, and unique personal environment on any given trait or individual difference variable. When it comes to spirituality, the formation of the apparatus through which we experience personal spirituality, our physiological setup through which we experience spirituality, is about 1/3 attributed to heritability. So we are hardwired for the capacity for transcendence. This heritable contribution increases over the course of adolescence. So in early adolescence, our family has a large effect on how we experience our relationship to the Creator. As we near early adulthood, late adolescence and emerging adulthood, there's a thrust from deep within of spiritual awakening, which maps onto nearly a 50% increase in the heritable contribution to personal spirituality. We're now looking at we're doing genotyping essentially. We're looking at specific alleles in the pathway of depression and seeing if those very same points in the genome are associated with the formation of the apparatus for transcendence.
I think basically, I don't want to be misunderstood. If one's considering answering this question, one can look at it two ways. You can look at it from a epidemiological perspective, and people are counting symptoms and it's important to make or not make diagnostic criteria. That's the way it works. If you're treating cases, that's not the way practice works. If you look at the DSM and the Latin numbers in the front, it says this is intended to serve as a teaching and clinical guide, and in all cases, clinical judgment must supersede strictly making or not making criteria order. That's what it says in the manual, okay? So, you're to do practice and people who do research, and some of us do both. Okay? And I think it's important that sometimes on diagnostic tests among people who've been traumatized. There are really a lot of non-diagnostic tests. It's just like the BASC, which my school psychologists know about, and so on. We're not seeing distress. It's not different than the norm group. It's not different than this group. So I think that there's something to this.
My question is there a way that we can take these findings and all this deep research that has gone on and the practical experience of interacting with people who've been tortured one way or the other, and be able to, using online tools and pictures and images and music, and extrapolate the research into something that can help lead larger numbers of people and even train larger numbers of people for the unknown mega disasters that may yet be coming?
You ask a question that troubles me a lot, because I actually don't think there's anything online that we can do. I do think that at the extremes of traumatization, when people really have all the symptoms, what is healing is another relationship. And yes, and I mean, I remember when I went first to New Orleans being so overwhelmed with, and I was dealing not with people who'd been I mean, they'd evacuated. But I gave a workshop, and there were twice this many people there. And I thought, my God, I mean, every one of these people wants to talk to me personally and tell me about their experience. It really, eventually I could put them in a group. I would have put them in a group, but it took an initial kind of debriefing. In a way, we're going on to the next thing. So I bet that with Lisa's extraordinary knowledge and sensitivity, and everybody else is here, one could come up with programs. But in the end, I really believe that what's healing has to be the personal relationship. It's enormously people expensive, this spirit expensive.
I applaud your work. I think that this is our task right now in our traumatic world, right? And that if you'd ask people in 1984, 85, do you think the Berlin Wall will be there in 100 years? Everyone would have thought, well, of course, and we may before then have a nuclear holocaust. There was not a sense of any imminent transformation. And yet it's quickly coming into focus that the prevalence and frequency of traumatic events is erupting around the world. And it may be that this is our Berlin Wall, an imminent transformation through which we learn to support and heal one another. It's deep within our human spirit. I think the triumph of the human spirit has this great power. I think of my own son, who I adopted at 1 year from an orphanage in St. Petersburg, Russia. And he was very excited to head out and come home. And we sat him by the river, and he was so delighted. His spirit was alive and well. And yet, that night when we fed him his first plump rotisserie chicken, he thought it was the most delightful thing he'd ever tasted. Each bite, rotisserie chicken, covered head to toe in rotisserie chicken, and we washed him up and put him to bed. And that night, I looked in his little hand, and he'd saved rotisserie chicken. So we have it in us to survive, but we also have it in us to do more than survive. And I'm fully in consort with you that we can do this, but it is a rapidly accelerating process, perhaps, through which we learn to do it.
My name is Reginald Evans. I'm actually a survivor of Hurricane Katrina. And I knew one of the... Yeah. One of the things that helped me get through it is that I realized, first of all, that the world that I once had no longer existed, but it also offered me an opportunity. I could either, just sort of capitulate and not move forward, or I could decide for myself, what is the life I now want to live? And I began to create the community that I needed for myself to be the best that I could be, even here in New York City. And for me, that meant, a strong spiritual base. So I found a church, and I was lucky enough to have friends who knew friends already in New York City, and I was able to connect with those people, and from those relationships, create the ones that I needed for myself. So my question for you guys is, are there programs out there to teach people in a more proactive and personal way to build the support systems and the community support that they need to move forward and grow?
That is, let me limit my comments to the United States Veterans Administration, who I think are doing, I've been associated with them since 1987 on a part-time basis, very part-time in psychiatry. And they do have programs, and I think they're terribly caring. And I'm speaking objectively on the basis of observations. This is not research. They have all kinds of programs. They have groups. They have groups, and they have one-on-one. They have psychiatrists provide medicine, and they have psychologists. And they try to reach out. They try to train people how to cope with their symptoms, if not get over them. They provide excellent types of really current, up-to-date therapy, and have been for quite a while. I'm talking about cognitive behavior therapy, exposure therapy. There's a lot going on. But, I don't think I can answer that question if you ask me, well, what about people who aren't veterans? I don't know. I can't answer that question. Maybe my learned colleagues can, but I can't.
Look, having a community is so important afterwards, being able to form a community. I think one very key thing is that have to relieve them of the sense of shame that is so isolating after a trauma. People feel so badly that they're suffering. Very often, their actual experience was during Katrina, but people lose trust after seeing the way in which the community, not the community, but actually the way you were portrayed, but the way you were also treated by the state and the feds and by the city. But as people can get past, can start to trust and start to build up a community, that is just so healing. Now, what seemed very important, and what somebody just wrote to me about today, because I'm wrapping up this Katrina stuff, and said was, we couldn't have done it if there hadn't been someone from the outside coming and confirming to us that it was okay that we felt this way, and helping us start to talk to one another. The vets in the mid-70s formed groups independent of the VA, because in those days they weren't very happy with the VA, and they brought in two psychiatrists, Robert Lifton and Hai Shatton. And this was in New York. Then these grew into all kinds of movements. But they had these two guys simply sitting there as observers while they talked about their experiences. But they needed the outside affirmation of what they were going through. So that's the beginning of an answer.
Do you have a comment?
Very quick comment. Okay. One of the interesting things, this has really come out of international meetings, is that there's been a tremendous interest in the last 4 or 5 years in the World Health Organization, and you see this a lot in Europe because I think the boundaries are more porous and there's smaller regions, of trying to figure out ways for communities to take care of themselves. And this has been identified, and I don't think much progress is made because it's such a hard question to get at. But communities, now in the case of Katrina, where the community was just wiped out, and that's one of the things that Katrina survivors talked about in the little study that is available, is that many people have been moved to places with lots of new resources, but the community didn't go with them, and that's really hard. So then you have to build a new community, which is you eloquently described. But this big interest in actually, in many cases, the community is hit, and it's still there. Even in Japan recently, the devastation in Japan, the communities were still there, physically still in the same place. And communities can probably help themselves far better than anyone else can, coming in and sort of telling them, here's what you need to do. And we just don't know how to do that. We don't even know where to begin, and that's kind of one of the things that's glaring at us right now, how to do that. So that's really the comment, and I wish I had a more, elucidated
May I
answer.
respond? I think you're absolutely right in that we have it within us to help each other in collective. Our TC students, our emerging psychologists, go down to Covenant House, which is one of the few places a youth who's homeless can find a bed. And our students have been working with homeless adolescent moms, so moms on the street with a little toddler or a baby, who come seeking shelter to Covenant House. And through the work of our emerging psychologists, together in collective, the young women support each other and find a path together. It comes through the dynamic of the group. It wouldn't have happened one-on-one. It happens because of the spirit of the collective group. So I so agree with you, and it's part of how we're trying to train our psychologists.
Just really quick.
Just one reference for you, and I'm racking my brains trying to think of the title, but the author's name is Rebecca Solnit, and it was a book published, say it again? Paradise in Hell. And she's talking about how much more effective the community is in healing itself, and how much more quickly they get their act together than the state and the city and the feds.
So we heard about some people lose trust, and we heard about how spirituality is really important. So how do you account for people who go through the same experience, let's say the Holocaust, for example, and before this traumatic experience, let's say they're all religious, very spiritual, and then some lose trust and become very anti-religious, and the others go the other way and become, religion is more central to their lives. Is it the other resiliency factors we talked about? Why do people go those two paths, and how do we predict who's going to go which path?
First of all, to resonate with what you're saying, that is absolutely the case, and it's shown throughout the literature. There's people who, through trauma, deepen their spirituality, and there's people who say God is dead. Right? So, absolutely, the literature is at your feet, and you are right. We don't know. We don't know.
What I want to say is that we have an excellent example of what we're talking about, relationship and community and spirituality and all of that coming together into practicality. I often refer to my doctorate, when I care to refer to it, as in somatic and spiritual psychology, as above, so below. So in East Harlem, you had the Reverend Norman and Margaret Eddy. And they created a program, okay? They moved their family in, and they lived in East Harlem, and they turned that neighborhood around. And it's quite a story of New York. And there's currently now a chair in the New York Theological Seminary where they are teaching clergy as part of their training. They're giving them a course in spiritual coordination. Mm-hmm. And I happen to be privileged enough to sit on a monthly group that meets with Norm Eddy, who is 91 years old and still around from his wheelchair, saying, if I were just 20 years younger, I could teach them how to do it. But it's about teaching the clergy to come off their pulpit and get into the community, but with the reminder that they don't do anything, so that they are the person from the outside, and they are the reminder that something larger than anybody comes together, and that larger than anybody is the community. And it requires an individual, but it also requires something put together larger than themselves. And the result is credit unions were established, drug gangs were dispersed, and a lot of other things. So it is going on, and it's going on right now.
I'm just curious, what type of research has been done in regard to the socialization of gender differences and resilience, and the overlay of spirituality and the cross-cultural differences of spirituality in regard to resilience. So how do those two factors influence one's ability to be resilient, or to at least appear to be resilient?
We looked at children who grew up in very difficult circumstances as an extreme case. And for instance, children of opiate addicts. And we saw that children who had a parent who was not at all spiritually oriented and was self-destructive, in fact, very readily, given a moment's opportunity, turned to any healthy family member and adapted the healthy family member's form of spirituality. Right. So the child has inherently within them an inchoate thrust towards healthy spiritual development. Now, if you take out questions of pathology and poverty, right, and take that notion of selective religious or selective spiritual socialization, that we tend towards health, right, we find that irrespective of the challenges facing the child, there's always that natural inclination to drink in the healthy spirituality from a mentor, a youth leader, anyone who takes in relationship a loving interest in that child. That's the developmental model. There are a few times where that is derailed. And one of them is indeed when there is an adversive experience of gender or ethnicity in that mix. So for instance, children who see images of God that are exclusively different from them will sometimes have a hard time forming a relationship. Children who receive a message from their religious community that they're not welcome for some reason having to do with, for instance, sexual orientation, have a hard time metabolizing that personal relationship with God. So there can be derailing social experiences in the spiritual path. In most cases, we find that the child works through that and finds ultimately a very personal connection with the Creator that is not fettered by poor messengers, right, or social matrix. Is that, yeah.
I would like at this point to thank not only our outstanding panel, but also it's obvious that our alums here in the audience have enormous experience in this area. And sorry we did not get to hear from more of you about the work that you're doing, but perhaps in the future, as we have more of these occasions, we'll be able to do that.